In the last lesson, you set up a test case that actually tests an Express API endpoint. Now, it worked the first time around, but it failed the second time around. The second time around, it failed because the email was already registered from the first time it ran. In this lesson, you'll learn how to use Jest lifecycle methods to run some code just before or after a test case. That'll allow you to set up some code that clears the database so your test cases can consistently execute as expected. Now, you can learn more about this over in the Jest documentation in the sidebar under Introduction. There's a section called Setup and Teardown. This outlines everything we're going to talk about in this lesson. We'll be using various lifecycle methods, such as those shown below, to actually configure our project. Let's go ahead and do just that over here inside of the user.test.js file. We're going to call a couple of functions that Jest provides us as globals, similar to how we have access to expect and to test. Right here, one of those is before each. I'll go ahead and call before each, passing in a single argument. This is a function to run. This function runs before each test case in this test suite. Now, in this case, we only have one test case, so it would only run a single time. Let's go ahead and add a simple console.log call inside of here so we can see when exactly this runs. And I'll just log out the message before each. Down below, we'll also call after each, which runs a single time after each of your test cases in the test suite. Right here, once again, we pass to it the function to run, and we'll just use console.log to print a message after each. Now, with this in place, we can go ahead and save our test suite. It's still going to fail because we're not actually manipulating the database just yet. But if I scroll up in the output, I should be able to see before in each print and then after each print afterwards. As long as you're seeing before each and after each, then everything is actually running correctly. Now, the next step we need to take is to actually do something meaningful, and we're going to go ahead and do something meaningful in before each. Now, we don't need after each for this particular project. I did want to let you know that it exists, though. We'll go ahead and remove that from our test suite, and we'll just use before each. Now, you also have access to before all and after all, which will run just a single time before your test cases or after them. In this case, though, before each is the correct one, because we want to make sure that every single test that runs in the same environment with the same test data in the database. Now, for the moment, all we're trying to do is wipe all of the users inside of there so our test can consistently run correctly, which means we need access to that user model. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and load it in. Const uppercase U user. I'll use require followed by ..source/models/user to load in that Mongoose model. Then all we're going to do is use some of the methods we have access to down below to delete all of the records. So what I'll actually be doing is removing the console.log call and using user. Right here, delete many. Now, if we call delete many, it's going to delete every single user since we haven't provided any sort of search criteria, and that's what we want. We want to start off with a nice, clean slate. Now, currently, nothing's going to work as expected because before each has asynchronous code inside of here, but we're not doing anything to tell Jest that it is asynchronous. So once again, we have the same options we had below with our test case. I could go ahead and provide the done parameter, calling it when I'm done, or I could go ahead and set this up as an async function, which is the approach that I'll take. Down below, we just use await with our promise. This is going to make sure that the users are deleted before Jest considers this done. Once it considers this done, it'll move on to the test cases. So we definitely want to make sure the users are gone before the test runs. So with this in place, we've solved the problem we had before. We added 4 lines of code to the user test suite, but down below, our test cases are going to pass, and they will consistently pass over time. because we're always starting off with an empty database, which is a good thing. We want to make sure that we have a consistent set of data for our tests to work with. Now, wiping all of the data is a good start, but there are also test cases that are going to test features like logging in. And in that case, it would be nice to have some very specific data in the database that we can use when testing. So we are going to start by deleting all of the users. Then we'll go ahead and add a user in that could be used with test cases, such as test cases for testing login, which we'll be doing in just a minute or two. So what we're going to do is create a new user right here in before each, just after we go ahead and call delete many, and I'll define that data up above, and then we'll pass it in down below. Right here, let's define a constant, which I'll call user1. Now I'm calling it user1 as opposed to just user, to leave the door open for other test users later on if we needed them. And this is just going to be an object with those basic properties on there. So right here, as an example, I will specify the name for our test user. I'm going to go ahead and use something like Mike, and as well, I'll provide the email for this test user, mike@example.com, and then I'll provide a password as well. I'll go ahead and use 56 what exclamation mark as my password, and there we go. We have all of the data we need to create this test user. Now, down below, we actually have to save them to the database, and we'll do that just after calling delete many. So right here, what I'm going to do is use await with the following. I'll use the new operator with user like we've done so many times before, and I'll provide the user1 object. Then right there, I'll just chain on a call to save things. So we're doing everything in one shot, as opposed to first storing this in a variable and then referencing it on the next line, though we could do that as well. For example, I can cut this out. I could have a variable called user, which I create up above like this. These two solutions are identical. We're going to go ahead and go with the first solution since everything fits on one line and it works pretty well for our purposes. So with this in place, our existing test case should still pass. We have our test user in there, yes, but the emails don't conflict, and that's a good thing. Right here, I'm going to go ahead and save user.test.js. That's going to rerun everything, and we can see we have a passing test suite. Now, the whole point of having this test data in the database is to test those other endpoints, like the ability to log in, and that is exactly what we're going to do down below. Now, don't worry, we will expand on our test cases such as this one once we learn more about Jest, but we're going to go one step at a time so we can keep all of this actually comprehensible. Right here, what we're going to do is call the test function once again. We're going to pass to it the name of our test, something along the lines of should log in existing user. Then we'll set up our async function, and we can go ahead and actually use supertest to test things out. So once again, I'll use await calling request and passing in our express application exactly like we've done up above. Now in this case, we're also trying to access an endpoint that uses post, so I'll be using post right here. Then we'll go ahead and provide the URL that is /users/login. From here, we're going to go ahead and send across good data. So in this case, I want to provide the correct data, the data that our one test user has been created with. So down below, let's go ahead and do just that. I call send to provide the data with the object like we did up above, and I need to provide my email and password to log in, so I'll go ahead and set both of those up right here. Now, the current approach would be to just type out the correct email and password inside of quotes. You could also just reference the ones on this object up above, and that's what I'm going to do. So right here, the email is not going to be a new string. We'll just grab the existing one from user1.email, and then the same thing for the password down below, user1.password. Now that we've sent the correct data off, we can expect something about the response, and once again, we're just going to stick to the status code. Right here, we will expect a 200, which is exactly what we should get. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and fire off the request and see if it works as expected. Right here, the test suite is rerunning, and in a couple of seconds, we should see all passing, and that is exactly what we have. So in this case, we are setting up test data for our test cases to interact with. Now, you might say, why not just create the user right here and then go ahead and try to log in? Well, the problem is that a lot of our test cases are going to need a user to already exist. Things for logging in, adding an avatar, updating a profile, creating a task, and others. So it's best to just do it once up above to set up the database and then use it over and over again in your test cases. Now it's challenge time. You're going to create a test case that makes sure when the credentials are bad, things fail as expected. So right here is what I'd like you to do. Test the login failure. You're going to create a new test case. Should not log in, non-existent user. Then you're going to send off the request with bad credentials. And by bad credentials, I mean anything but what we have right up here. Then you're going to go ahead and expect the correct status code in the response. Feel free to refer to the application code or run the request in Postman if you forget what that was. And finally, test your work. Save the test suite, and you should go from 8 passing test cases to 9. If the test case fails, try to use the error message to figure out why. All right, pause the video, knock that out. When you're done, come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's get to it by defining the new test case. I'll be calling test one more time right up above or down below. The order of your tests is not particularly important. And then we'll go ahead and set up the name. Should not log in. Non-existent user. Perfect. We'll set up our function as an async function. We'll be using async await in almost all of our test cases, since pretty much everything we're doing is indeed asynchronous. And right here, we're going to send off the request with bad credentials. So it starts off exactly like what we had above. I use await, I call request passing in app, then I call post with the same path /users/login, and I still want to send some data. I'm just going to send bad data. So I could leave something off, or I could just have a bad password as an example. So I'll set email equal to the following. user1.email. You did not need to do this. You could have used any sort of set of credentials. And then I'll set password equal to something else. This is not my pass, or anything else would have worked. Once again, it's not important that you had the exact same data, just something that's going to cause the failure. Next up, we want to expect something about the status code, so we call the expect method that supertest provides. And in this case, if you looked at the code, you'd remember it's a 400 for when someone tries to log in, but it fails. Now, with this in place, the only thing left to do is to test our work. That's step number 4. So I'll go ahead and remove the challenge comments. I'm going to save the test suite, and we'll see what we get down below. Hopefully, we have 9 passing test cases, and that is exactly what we're getting. So there we go. We now have test cases that create data and test cases that work with existing data, and we were able to do all of that by using before each and Mongoose methods we've already worked with earlier in the class. So when we use Jest, it gives us everything we need to set up our test suite without having to write a whole bunch of code ourselves. We're able to get up and running really quickly, even with more advanced testing things like testing and express application. Here we have a test suite with 3 tests and just 36 lines of code. Now, yes, we're going to add more, but this is a great place to start. In the next lesson, we'll continue on writing test cases. I'm excited to get to it, so let's jump right into the next lesson.